The night Celeste Aubin walked into the Meridian Club wearing her mother's old gown, she told herself it didn't matter what anyone thought. She'd been telling herself that lie for 26 years. The dress was ivory, empire-waisted, with a small tear near the left seam that she'd sewn shut with cream thread she found at the bottom of her mother's sewing kit. It wasn't a bad dress. It had been beautiful once, probably in 1987 when her mother wore it to some forgettable gala in Montréal. Now it sat slightly wrong on Celeste's shoulders, the fabric pulling where it shouldn't, the hem a centimetre too long for the heels she'd borrowed from her co-worker Diane. She'd spent 40 minutes doing her hair in the bathroom of her apartment above the laundromat on St. Laurent, squinting into the mirror that never quite showed her whole face at once. She'd done her best. She knew, walking through those front doors and handing her coat to a man in white gloves, that her best was still not going to be enough for this room. The Meridian Club was one of those places that didn't advertise. You either knew about it, or you didn't. Old money. Old agreements. The kind of building where the carpets cost more per square foot than Celeste made in a month doing accounts receivable for a mid-size import firm on Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. She only knew about the benefit gala because her father had included her name on the invitation. The first time in 3 years he'd acknowledged her existence, and she'd been stupid enough to come. Her half-sister, Renée, was already there. Of course she was. Renée Aubin, wearing something that probably had its own name. Not a dress, a creation, in deep burgundy silk that caught the light every time she moved. She was standing near the bar with their father, one hand curled around a glass of champagne, the other resting on their father's arm in a gesture that looked affectionate and was actually territorial. She was 28, and she had their father's jaw and their father's last name on her business cards, and she had never once had to do her own laundry. Celeste watched from just inside the entrance, still smoothing the front of the ivory dress with one hand. Renée saw her before their father did. There was a half-second, a very specific half-second, where Renée's expression went from social to something private and mean and satisfied, the way a cat looks right before it bats something fragile off a shelf. Then she smiled, wide and warm for the room. "Celeste," she said, loud enough that the 2 men standing nearby turned. "You came. I didn't think the invitation said formal." Her gaze moved down the dress, slowly, and then back up. Is that Maman's old gown? From the Thibodeau wedding." Their father blinked. He looked at the dress. He looked at Renée. He said nothing. Celeste felt the heat climb her throat. "Nice to see you too," she said. "No, truly," Renée said, tilting her head with a studied concern that was about as genuine as a press release. "It's very sweet that you have something of hers. You should take care of it. Vintage pieces are delicate." She lowered her voice by exactly the right amount, still audible to everyone nearby, still performing. "Especially ones that weren't made for your, well, you know." One of the men near Renée pressed his lips together. The other found something very interesting to look at on his cufflink. Celeste said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. She'd had to get good at it. You learn, after enough years of being the inconvenient daughter, the one from the first marriage, the one who didn't get the school in Westmount, or the summers in Tremblant. You learn that the thing they want from you is a reaction. They want you to cry or snap or go red-faced so they can tell the story later about how difficult you are, how sensitive, how you can't take a joke. So she said nothing. She looked at her father, who was examining his champagne glass with great interest, and she understood that he'd invited her tonight the way you invite an obligation. A box to tick. He hadn't wanted her here. He'd wanted to be able to say, if anyone asked, that he'd included her. "Excuse me," she said, and she walked away from both of them into the room. The Meridian Club's main hall was enormous, built in the Edwardian style, with coffered ceilings and columns that ran up to gilt moldings along the top of every arch, long tables with white linens, candles, a string quartet near the windows that faced the mountain. It was the kind of room that made you feel underdressed, regardless of what you were wearing. Celeste had done the accounts receivable for a venue like this, once briefly, a contract job that lasted 3 months, and she'd been struck then by how much money it cost to make a room look effortless. She found a spot near the back, close to one of the columns, where she could see the room without being too visible herself. She pulled a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and held it the way everyone else was holding their champagne. And she made herself breathe. She was good at numbers. She was good at finding where the money went, at spotting the line in a spreadsheet where something didn't add up. The single entry that looked right on first glance but was 2 cents off, and those 2 cents were the thread you pulled. She had a gift for it. Her former supervisor at Delacroix Financial had told her she was the best she'd seen at forensic reconciliation, and then the firm had been acquired, and the new owners had let her go because she made them nervous, which was a thing that happened when you were too good at finding things people wanted hidden. Now she did mid-level accounts receivable, and she lived above a laundromat, and she wore her dead mother's dress to charity galas, because she had exactly one dress appropriate for an event like this, and it belonged to a woman who had loved her. She was thinking about leaving. She was calculating the minimum amount of time she'd need to stay before she could reasonably go without it meaning anything, 40 minutes maybe, when she became aware of a shift in the room. It wasn't loud, there was no announcement, but she'd worked enough events in that 3-month contract to recognize the particular recalibration that happens when the most important person in the room arrives. The conversations didn't stop. The music kept playing. But something changed, a directional thing. The way flowers turn. She turned too, without meaning to. He came in from the side entrance, which was already unusual. Most people who wanted to be seen used the main doors. He didn't use the main doors. He came in from a door near the service corridor, which meant he either didn't care about being seen, or he was specifically choosing not to make an entrance, and both options struck her as a kind of power in itself. He was tall. Not imposingly so, maybe 6'2", broad through the shoulders but not heavy, the kind of build that read as physical work rather than a gym. He wore a dark suit, charcoal, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a thin crescent, old and faded. His hair was darker than his suit, and he hadn't styled it in any deliberate way. He looked like a man who had been awake for a long time and had made peace with it. He was, she estimated, somewhere between 40 and 45. She knew who he was because her firm, 3 years ago, had done a subsidiary audit for a company that was 2 shells removed from something called Harlow Beckett Holdings, and she'd gone far enough down that rabbit hole to learn the name attached to the top, before her supervisor at the time had told her very gently that she should stop going down that particular rabbit hole. His name was Voss. Not the Voss from the name list, a different Voss entirely. His first name was never in any document she'd found. Just Voss, like that was enough. He moved through the room the way water moves through a narrow space, not aggressively, but with complete confidence in its own path. People adjusted. They didn't always seem to know why. He stopped to shake someone's hand near the second table, exchanged 4 words, moved on. He didn't smile. He was not looking at her. She had no reason to think he would look at her. She looked away. She checked her phone. She had a text from her roommate asking if she'd remembered to turn off the stovetop. She had, and a work email about a quarterly reconciliation that wasn't due until Friday. She answered the roommate. She did not answer the work email. She put her phone away and found that Renée had migrated across the room and was now standing 12 feet away with a fresh glass of champagne and a new audience. 2 men, both in their 50s, both wearing the particular expression of men who were accustomed to being flattered. Renée was doing the laugh, the one that sounded spontaneous and wasn't, the one that made her earrings move in a way that was very specifically appealing. She was good at it. Celeste had spent years being the proof that their father valued Renée's particular kind of good. One of the men caught Celeste's eye by accident. Renée followed his gaze. "Oh," she said. She didn't miss a beat. She gave Celeste a small, pitying smile. "Still finding your people?" The men looked at Celeste with the polite, disinterested sympathy you give to someone standing alone at a party. And then they looked back at Renée, and Celeste understood that she was in this room At this moment, essentially furniture. She reached up and touched the seam on the shoulder of her mother's dress. The thread she'd sewn. Cream on ivory, nearly invisible. Her mother had had small hands. Strong, though. The kind of hands that knew how to fix things. She exhaled. She started to turn, already planning her route to the coat check, already deciding that 40 minutes was 35 more than she needed, when she realized someone was standing to her left. She hadn't heard him approach. She didn't know how long he'd been there. Voss was looking at the room, not at her. He had a glass of something, water or vodka, she couldn't tell, and he held it loosely, not drinking it, the way people held drinks at events when they didn't actually want the drink. His jaw was set. There was a small tension around his eyes that she recognized as tiredness rather than anger, though on a face like his the difference was subtle. She did not say anything. He didn't either. Then, without turning his head, he said, "Which one is she to you?" It wasn't quite a question. His voice was low, accented slightly, Quebecois under something else, something with harder consonants. "I'm sorry, the woman in burgundy." He still wasn't looking at her. The one who just, he paused, selected his words with the careful economy of someone who disliked waste, "made you touch your dress." Celeste dropped her hand. She was quiet for a moment. "Half-sister," she said. He made a sound, not quite acknowledgement. And the older man she came in with, my father, now he did turn, just slightly. Enough to look at her with those tired, measuring eyes, and she had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling of being assessed. Not the way men usually assessed women at events like this, which was visual and immediate, and she'd learned to ignore it. This was different. This was the feeling of being evaluated as a proposition, a column of figures, usefulness being calculated in real time. "Aubin," he said. She blinked. "How do you?" "Your father and I have an arrangement." He looked back at the room. "Had. The particulars have become complicated." The way he said complicated told her that complicated was doing a great deal of work. "I'm Celeste," she said, because it seemed strange not to, because he knew her last name, and she knew only his, and the whole thing was strange enough that normal felt like an anchor. "I know," he said. She stared at the side of his face for 3 full seconds. That's a slightly alarming thing to say to someone you just met. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of something that under different circumstances might have been one. "Your father mentioned you worked in financial reconciliation, forensic accounts." He mentioned that. He mentioned it was a waste. The heat came back to her throat, but slower this time. Older. The kind of heat you feel at a scar, not a wound. That sounds like him. "He's wrong," Voss said, flatly, without particular kindness, the way you say something that's simply true and doesn't require ornamentation. Forensic reconciliation is the only accounting that matters. Anyone can add. Finding where money goes when someone is trying to stop you from finding it, that's different. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "Are you offering me something?" she said, "or asking me something?" He turned fully to face her then, and it was the first time she'd seen his face straight on, and she noticed that the scar above his eyebrow was paired with a smaller one along his jaw, barely visible, and his eyes were a dark grey-green that in this light could have been either. He was not handsome in any easy, uncomplicated way. He was the kind of face that took a moment, that you kept coming back to. "Both," he said, "possibly." She looked at the rest of the room, at her father, who was laughing at something near the bar, at Renée, who had glanced over and was now doing an excellent performance of not watching, at the string quartet, at the candles, at all the effortless money arranged just so. "I do forensic reconciliation for a company on Notre Dame de Grâce," she said. "I make 54,000 a year. I rent above a laundromat." "I know," he said again. "You need to stop doing that. I need someone who can find a leak," he said, "in 7 figures, monthly, for the past 11 months. Everyone I've sent into those books has come back with nothing or hasn't come back at all." He paused. "The first kind." She processed this. "Hasn't come back at all," she repeated. "The first kind," he said again, steadily, which meant the second kind also existed, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, which was perversely the most honest thing anyone in this room had said to her all evening. "I need to know," she said. If this is a dinner conversation or a job offer, it's neither, he said. It's an observation that you are the only person in this room with the particular kind of mind that solves the particular kind of problem I have, and I don't believe in wasting resources. He looked at her dress, but not the way Renée had. He looked at it the way someone looks at a closed door and thinks about what's behind it. You came here tonight, and they made you feel like nothing. That's their mistake, not yours. The string quartet switched pieces. Something slower, something that moved under the conversation the way cold water moves under ice. Celeste looked at her mother's dress, at the cream thread holding the seam. She thought about the Harlow Beckett audit, about the subsidiary shells, about the number she'd found once buried in a reconciliation file, a number that was exactly $2 million off and pointed somewhere she'd been told not to point. She thought about $54,000 a year above a laundromat. She thought about Renée's face when she'd said vintage pieces are delicate. "What's the name of the entity?" she said. "The one with the leak." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Those grey-green eyes, that tired face. Something shifted in them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that was the precondition of warmth, the way ground thaws before anything grows. "Blackwater Meridian," he said, sub-account level 4. She knew the name. She'd seen it once in the file she'd been told to stop looking at. It sat at the edge of her memory like a splinter she'd never quite gotten out. "Give me the access codes and 48 hours, she said. "I'll tell you if the leak is internal or external, and I'll tell you which account it's running through. And if I give you the codes," he said, "what do I get in return?" She met his eyes. "You get the leak found, which is what you said you needed." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "Monday," he said, 8 a.m. "The address will come through tomorrow." Then he looked back at the room, and she understood that the conversation was over. Not rudely, not dismissively, but with the simple efficiency of a man who didn't spend more time on a thing than the thing required, and found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind it. Most people who cut conversations short did it because they were bored. He cut it short because it was finished. There was a difference. He moved away toward the far side of the room, unhurried, and she watched him go, and she noticed that across the hall, Renée was watching her now with an expression that Celeste had never seen on her half-sister's face before. Uncertainty. Celeste reached up and touched the seam on her mother's dress one more time. The cream thread, strong and nearly invisible, she let out a slow breath. She did not leave at 40 minutes. She stayed the full evening. The address that came through on Saturday morning was a building in Old Montréal, on a street she'd walked past 100 times without ever looking at it directly. The kind of building that repels casual attention. Old limestone, no signage, the windows dark in the way that means the glass is treated rather than the lights off. She arrived Monday at 7:58. A man she didn't know let her in without a word and led her to a room on the 3rd floor that contained a desk, a laptop, a printer, a telephone she suspected was encrypted, and a cup of coffee that was still hot, which meant someone had anticipated her arrival to within approximately 4 minutes. She sat down. She opened the laptop. The access codes were in a folder on the desktop, no label on the folder, the codes in a plain text file. She spent 7 minutes reading through the security architecture of the system before she started actually looking at the books, because that was how you did it. You didn't walk into a building without understanding where the doors were. Voss came in at 9:15. He was in a different dark suit. He looked like he hadn't slept, though his posture gave nothing away. He brought a second cup of coffee and set it on the desk near her right hand without being asked, and she thought about the fact that he'd noticed, at the Gala, which hand she used, and she filed that away. "How far are you?" he said. "I've been here 2 hours. I'm reading the architecture." She didn't look up from the screen. "You've had 7 people in this system over the past 11 months. 2 of them didn't know what they were looking for. 3 of them knew what they were looking for and missed it on purpose." A silence. "You can tell that," he said. "Already. It's in the notation style. Someone who misses something by accident notates differently than someone who misses something deliberately. The deliberate one's smooth, They round. They make the blanks look like nothing was ever there. She highlighted a column on the screen. This person, third auditor I'm guessing, based on the timestamp, was very good. But they rounded the same way twice, same variable, different months. Nobody rounds the same variable the same way by accident. She heard him exhale very quietly through his nose. "Who do I have in this building?" he said. "I don't know yet. Give me the rest of today and tomorrow morning." He moved to the edge of the desk. He didn't sit. He stood the way he'd stood at the gala, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the room she needed, and looked at the screen. She was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, a kind of atmospheric pressure. "You're not afraid of this," he said. "It was an observation, not a compliment. I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said. "Spreadsheets aren't one of them." "I said something at the gala," he said, "about people not coming back, I remember. You didn't ask me to clarifying. I understood what you were clarifying." She scrolled to the next account. "I also understood that you told me deliberately. You weren't being threatening, you were being honest. You wanted me to know what the work was, and I appreciated that." She paused. "Most people aren't honest with me about what things cost." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Denser. She kept her eyes on the screen. "Your father," he said eventually, "owes this organization a significant sum. He borrowed from a fund that I now control. He knows this, and I suspect he believes that producing you, sending you the invitation, was a way of offering something in trade without having to say so directly." She stopped scrolling. She sat very still. "So I'm collateral," she said. "You were, potentially, what he intended." His voice hadn't changed. "What I'm offering is different. You are not collateral to me. You are a forensic accountant who can do something no one else I've hired has been able to do. I'll pay you for that, separately. Whatever he owes, that's his debt." She turned her chair to look at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without performing, without any of the layered social behavior she'd spent her whole life learning to read and distrust. He was exactly what he appeared to be, which in her experience was the rarest possible thing in a man with money. "My father tried to use me," she said. "Yes, you know I'm going to be furious about that." "I assumed," he said. "But you're telling me anyway. You'd find it in the accounts eventually," he said. "You'd find your name in the margin of something. I'd rather you hear it from me." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the screen. "I'm going to find your leak," she said, "and then you and I are going to have a very separate conversation about my father." "Agreed," he said. He didn't move away. He stayed at the edge of the desk, and she was aware of him there, that atmospheric pressure, and neither of them spoke, and the room held the silence easily, the way good rooms do, the way rooms do when two people in them have decided, without saying so, that they can be in the same space without pretending. She found the leak at 11:47 the next morning. It was elegant, she had to admit. Whoever had built it had a real understanding of how money looks when it isn't trying to hide. It wasn't buried deep or encrypted into abstraction. It sat in plain sight in a reserve account subledger, disguised as a recurring operational cost, facilities maintenance Q-series, that billed in a perfectly ordinary way, regular intervals, unremarkable amounts. What made it visible to her was a discrepancy in the GST line, a rounding error so small that 7 people had walked past it. 2 cents on a $100,000 entry, 2 cents off in exactly the same direction every single time. Nobody makes the same mistake twice, not accidentally. She printed the report. She walked down the hall to where Voss was in a meeting she'd been told not to interrupt, and she knocked on the door anyway, because she'd been told not to, and the report was in her hand, and this was not the kind of thing you let sit. The door opened. A man she didn't know, large, unhappy about the knock. Behind him, Voss, seated at a table with 2 others she didn't recognize. She held up the report. Voss looked at it, then at her. He said something in French to the man who'd opened the door, too low and quick for her to catch, and the man stepped back and she walked in. She put the report on the table in front of him. Q-Series Facilities Maintenance, she said. It's a ghost account. Whoever built it has access to the subledger at the reserve level, which means they're either in accounting or they have someone in accounting. The money's routing through 2 shell intermediaries before it disappears. I can give you the account numbers and the routing path. I can also tell you approximately when it started and cross-reference that with personnel records, if you have them. The room was very quiet. One of the men she didn't know looked at Voss. Voss looked at the report. He didn't touch it. He read it from where it lay on the table, and she watched his expression change in the way his expressions changed. Slowly, carefully, like a calculation running through a machine that was being very deliberate about showing its work. "You said 48 hours, he said. "I finished early." Something moved in his face. That almost smile again, the shadow of one. "Leave the report," he said. "There's a car downstairs. It'll take you wherever you need to go." She looked at the room, at the men she didn't know, at Voss. "The conversation about my father," she said. "We said separate." "Tomorrow," he said. 10 a.m., she nodded. She looked at the report on the table, the neat columns, the routing numbers, the 2-cent error that had run for 11 months without anyone catching it, the thread she'd pulled that had unraveled everything. She walked out. The car was a black SUV with a driver who didn't speak, which was fine. She didn't want to speak either. She sat in the back with her hands in her lap and watched the limestone buildings of old Montréal scroll past the window. The old stone, the narrow streets. She thought about her mother's dress, still hanging on the back of her closet door at home. The cream thread. The seam she'd stitched shut herself. She thought about Renée's face at the gala, looking at her across the room after she'd spoken to Voss. The uncertainty, the recalculation. The first time in 26 years that Celeste had seen her half-sister look at her and not know what she was seeing. She thought about what Voss had said about her father. You'd find it in the accounts eventually. She would have. She always did. The car turned onto St. Laurent, and she could see the laundromat from a block away, the neon sign in the window, the lights of her apartment above it. She'd lived there for 2 years, and she'd always looked at it as a temporary thing, a placeholder, something that would change when something else changed. But sitting in the back of this car, she thought maybe she'd been wrong about that. Maybe the placeholder was actually just her life, and the question was what you decided to do inside it. She had the routing numbers memorized. She had the account names. She had the 11-month trail of a 2-cent error running in exactly the same direction every single time. And she knew what it meant and where it led, and she knew that tomorrow at 10 a.m. she was going to walk back into that building and have a conversation about her father's debt that was going to be hard and necessary and real. She was not afraid. She was, she realized, sitting in the back of a car that smelled like leather and something cold, watching the neon of the laundromat get closer. She was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where the numbers had been trying to lead her.